What's up, Bitcoin Magazine podcast listeners?
Welcome back to the show, bro. Let's go.
I'm Dave, and that's Grahm over there, kind of brooding.
Yeah, it's classic Grahm over here. Came back and actually brought Dave some pickles.
Well, Grahm, thanks for this jar of pickles.
No, I made those, Dave. Those are from my garden.
Mr. Green Thumb.
Thank you. You should try one.
I'll try one after the show.
Try one now.
So, we haven't done news in a while.
No, we haven't, which isn't weird at all.
No, it's not unusual.
Well, okay. What's going on in the Bitcoin universe right now, Dave?
Well, Mr. Peterson...
Don't say my last name on air. We've talked about this.
Well, Mr. Peterson, after the news today, we're talking with Max Webster. And we're going to interview him about a recent study his company has published about Bitcoin adoption in Latin America.
That's right, Mr. Hollerith. And he's also a Bitcoin rapper by the name of Cypher Perro, which of course translates to Cypher Dog. And we're going to play his tune, We Take Bitcoin, at the end of the episode, so make sure you stick around for that.
That comes later, but first, the news. In a sign of privacy-preserving and open-source solidarity, the Bitcoin payment processor BTCPay server has launched a crowdfunding campaign for Tor. BTCPay told Bitcoin Magazine that it wanted to help raise money for Tor because it appreciates the browser's privacy features, and because it noticed that it was previously soliciting donations through BitPay, which it feels do not protect the privacy of contributors as well as its own services could. If you're interested, you can make a donation to Tor through the browser's subdomain through July 29th.
In an emerging Bitcoin use case that would certainly not protect your privacy, a city in Canada has become the first to allow Bitcoin-based municipal tax payments. Richmond Hill, a city of 20,000 constituents, will enable the payment option through a partnership with Coinberry Exchange. In September, city staffers will report on its effectiveness and determine whether the payment option could be expanded to more city levies. A representative of Coinberry told Bitcoin Magazine that the group is hopeful the option will expand to other municipalities soon, even Toronto.
While Canadians can pay their taxes in BTC, the U.S. government has taken a decidedly different stance on Bitcoin. When President Trump tweeted last week that he is not a fan of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, he said that their value is highly volatile and based on thin air. The president's post ignited an epic Twitter thread, but didn't really accomplish anything. For the most part, Bitcoin Twitter reactions to Trump's stance are snarky and combative. If nothing else, it was a moment that galvanized the community and brought more notoriety to Bitcoin than usual. Plus, the price got pumped.
Speaking of things Donald Trump doesn't like, Iran has been a hotbed for Bitcoin mining activity for some time thanks to the subsidized energy offered there and the bevy of U.S. sanctions that hinder the national economy. While news of Iran cracking down on miners has been prevalent, recent local reports suggest that the government will soon officially authorize Bitcoin mining. While it's unclear what a government-sanctioned mining industry would look like in Iran, it would certainly be a major development for the country and the international mining ecosystem overall.
Max Webster got his start in crowdsourced local energy projects for schools, churches, and small businesses. 3 years later, he was in Mexico City leading growth and adoption for solar energy. This year, he's co-founder of Entiende Bitcoin, a consultancy focused on spreading Bitcoin adoption. We brought Max on the show to talk about a recent study his company's published measuring Bitcoin adoption throughout Latin America. Before we get into the study, though, I wanted to ask, how did you get into cryptocurrency? What was your entry point?
Yeah. So like a lot of people, I had read about Bitcoin a long time ago. I think I read about it in 2011 for the first time. I thought it was a really cool idea, but I thought, well, this will never work. I mean, it's interesting, but there's no chance Bitcoin's actually going to catch on and stick around. I didn't understand the intricacies of how proof of work or what the blockchain was. So I kind of just thought it was cool, then forgot about it. Fast forward, I moved down to Mexico in 2015 to help start a solar energy company. And while I was living there, I saw that all of my friends, had their savings in pesos. And over the 3 or 4 years I was living in Mexico, I saw the peso to dollar conversion rate go from about 13 or 14 pesos to the dollar to about 19 or 20 pesos to the dollar today. And I remember thinking, man, like, your purchasing power, if you're saving in pesos, is just getting eroded very slowly. I started reading more about that and saw that there were obviously countries where that was way worse. And I made some friends from Argentina, from Venezuela. And so I was interested already in, finding a way for people to save in dollars or some other sort of harder currency. Ultimately stumbled upon Bitcoin. I was also looking at Ethereum for, the idea of sort of decentralized energy trading related to what we were doing with the solar company.
Right.
Ultimately came back to Bitcoin and said, holy crap, I can't believe this thing hasn't died. I went on like a 3-month binge and, 2 years later, here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. So Entiende Bitcoin, is that a company, or is that just the name of your study? Can you explain more about what it is?
Yeah, Entiende Bitcoin is a consultancy. We sort of focus on two things. One, we help companies, Bitcoin-focused companies, develop and distribute products in Latin America and eventually other emerging markets. The second thing we do is we try and create open source resources, educational resources, and research so that the whole community can use it to build better products to include more people in the Bitcoin revolution.
Yeah. I was struck when I read your study, just generally how easy it was to digest, which I think is not always the most common thing with the Bitcoin study.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think that's the real like value that that it's bringing, is that there's actually there's very few surveys that I see about Bitcoin adoption, let alone Bitcoin adoption in emerging markets.
Yeah. And that was our goal is, I feel like in general, anything that seems complex, including, for example, the financial system today, probably shouldn't be. So, our goal is how can we make our findings as easy to digest as possible. We want everyone to be able to read it. So that was our goal. Happy to hear it worked.
Yeah, dude. And I'm just curious what your take is on sort of the current standard of the financial system. I mean, people who come to Bitcoin can come for a variety of reasons, from just wanting to diversify their investment portfolio to wanting to start a new monetary order. So like, where do you fall on that spectrum?
Oh man, it depends on the day. No, I'm kidding. I think in general, I feel like, I guess this is something I've had since childhood. I feel like it's wrong to try and make things opaque for people. I feel like in general, the very few things in the world are truly complex. And, obviously there's a lot of things that are complex, but I feel like a lot of things are made complex needlessly. People try and sort of pull the wool over other people's eyes. And I think, for me, this was, I guess, kind of, a question of social inclusion. I grew up in the US and had access to all kinds of opportunities, a stable currency, all kinds of financial, a working financial system. Moving down to Mexico taught me how lucky I was. The US is not perfect by any means. And, I certainly do share some of the Bitcoin community's concerns around inflation, around having a monetary system that's controlled arbitrarily. But I think it really was, it put a light for me on how lucky I was living in another country where, my friends, just by virtue of being on the wrong side of an imaginary line, did not have access to these same tools. And so for me, I think if you want a functioning global system and you want the most creative output, you got to give people access. And I think, in the 90s, as a kid, I was 8 or 9 when I first started playing with the internet. And I thought, man, how cool. Anyone, anywhere in the world can have access to the Library of Alexandria at their fingertips. Who knows what people are going to make with that? And I feel the same way with Bitcoin. There's 4 or 5 billion people that lack access to basic financial resources, basic banking, basic stable currencies. Who knows what they're going to, all of us are going to come up with over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So for me, it's an issue of inclusion. It's an issue of creativity. It's an issue of justice. And just in general, it really frustrates me when people, that already have a lot of power, already have a lot of wealth, try and sort of pull the wool over everyone else's eyes. And I feel like Bitcoin is, the most interesting political project I've ever seen to sort of combat that.
Yeah. Some people say that Bitcoin is inherently is not a political object. It's completely irrelevant. It doesn't care about your ideological beliefs. So you sound like you're saying something different.
Well, I think Bitcoin is apolitical in the sense that, it doesn't have a political ideology, so to speak, but I think it's very much a political project in the idea that, politics at some level is the study of power. And, one of the two ways power, usually gets controlled is through force, military, and obviously now through sort of economics or money creation. I think the ability to create, distribute, and to create and distribute money is one of the most powerful tools in the world. That's why governments and the banking system, have such a privileged position. And I think Bitcoin basically says, well, what if we, take the ability to create money, and we take the ability to regulate who can and cannot send a transaction and make that neutral? Even though it's apolitical, it opens up all kinds of possibilities for people today who are oppressed. And so, from a perspective of power, I think that's a seismic shift.
Right.
So, sorry if this goes too philosophical. I can bring it down to
No, totally. I went there. It's more than anything. It's a mechanism for money is a mechanism for control,
right?
And this is sort of a way to, theoretically at least, we haven't really seen it in practice, to give everybody the opportunity to be at least in control of their own stuff.
Yeah, and just for some very simple examples, someone today that can't save, they don't have access to a bank account, or they don't have access to a PayPal account. Who knows what people in communities that don't have these tools already, who knows what kinds of interesting businesses or projects they're going to start when they can start, taking jobs that pay European salaries, or taking jobs or creating companies that can create products and services that, Americans or, people in the US never would have thought of, just because they have a totally different backdrop and a totally different set of context. I think the way I like to think about this is that Bitcoin facilitates a flourishing of worldwide creativity. It helps people break free of artificial bondage, and who knows what's going to come out of it. And, I feel excited and privileged to be even a small part of that.
Beyond even that, I think one of the things that terrifies me the most is the idea of this widening gap between people who have access to all these amazing technological products and people who don't, and what kind of rift that would create. I'm not necessarily like a pro technocrat, but I do think that creating such a division, it can create a widening gap of what humanity is.
Absolutely. And I think, at an even more basic level, you've got a lot of folks in this community who, I guess come from the Austrian school or whatever. I don't necessarily agree with all of that thinking. But I do think that there's something to be said for, the massive wealth and inequality in the world that comes from, the ability for those that have assets to artificially inflate the price of those assets versus those that don't. And I think what I love about Bitcoin is anyone can buy Bitcoin, and no one can take it away from you. So maybe you only have $100 or, even $50 or something to start, but you can buy Bitcoin with that. And unlike, buying real estate or even gold or, potentially stocks, you don't have to, the barrier to access is dramatically lowered. And I think that's a big deal.
Right. And that's what I thought was so interesting about your study. So important about it is that you're literally at the front lines of trying to teach people how to use this technology and see if it's actually, viable from a user standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So, you started off doing it in Mexico City.
Right.
And why did you pick Mexico City?
So I picked Mexico City for, I guess, two reasons. One, I wanted to go somewhere in Latin America. And two, Mexico City was where I had sort of most of my connections and experience working. I've been living there for almost 4 years on and off. And it was just a natural place to get started. There's also, 30 million people. So there's a pretty wide, variety of social classes, a wide variety of users. It seemed like a good place to start.
Speaking of the start, did you seek funding first, or did you try this on your own? And because I know you did this study in two waves.
Yeah. So, sort of casually, I've been playing with this and trying to just get my friends to adopt in Mexico for a while, obviously back in the States as well. And I guess at the end of last year, I've been kind of trying to decide, okay, how can we make this a bit more sustainable? So we were very fortunate. We approached a few folks. The first study we did was with around 40 people. That was in November, December 2018. And then we partnered with Give Crypto, which is a nonprofit here in the United States out of San Francisco. They funded the first project. Then, that was only 40 people. We had some interesting results. And I said, let's go get more data. Let's do a much more in-depth study. And so we approached a few more folks. We found an awesome partner in Bitso. Bitso is like the Coinbase or the leading cryptocurrency exchange of Mexico and eventually of Latin America. And we basically approached them and said, hey, we'd like to go deeper. We think we could come up with some interesting product and strategy ideas for you guys. They were really excited and were a great partner to work with.
Could we dig into the methodology a little bit? Could you explain the criteria, the rule set, all that?
Yeah, totally. So the first study was pretty simple. We had, I think, 38 people in total, 29 of whom were from Mexico and living in Mexico, and then 9 of them were foreigners or immigrants living in Mexico. And we basically took those two groups, split them in half. The group with the locals, we basically gave them a 2-hour workshop. And in that workshop, we explained to them what Bitcoin was, why it and stablecoins, we also use stablecoins in the study, and I can explain why as well, but why they were both potentially good stores of value relative to the peso. Then we helped people buy their first Bitcoin. We taught them the difference between using a custodial wallet and a non-custodial wallet, so keeping their keys with an exchange or keeping them themselves, and then let them decide how they wanted to store their Bitcoin. The second group, we then focused on remittances or international payments. These were all people living in Mexico City who maybe they were from a different Mexican town or from a different country, and we helped them use Bitcoin to send a payment back to their families and get that money into their families' bank accounts.
Could you give us some of the user demographics?
Absolutely. So the first study, we don't have quite as much data on that. The second study, I can go in much more detail. The second study, we had some interesting findings from the first study, but it was only, like I said, 30, 40 people. We came back and said, let's get a 10x larger sample size. So this time we had around 300 people. And then to give you just some quick demographics, 2/3 male, 1/3 female. 65% were millennials, so under the age of 30. 25% were between the ages of 30 and 45. And then 10% were baby boomers, so over the age of 45. 80% had a university or higher level of education, and the other 20% high school or less. And I think that is indicative of the fact that our group was a more middle-class Mexican group. We ended up choosing that group for a couple of reasons, but that was kind of who we focused on. They, in general, had more money to get started, to buy some Bitcoin with, more space on their phone, those kinds of things. And then 80% of those people were native Mexicans. The other 20% were either foreigners from another Latin American country or from Europe.
Overall, what was the sentiment that you felt towards Bitcoin after the workshops and after working with these people?
In general, the 100 people that came to the workshops, we did much more in-depth interviews. And I would say the general sentiment was people were interested. I would say, I think we had about 40% that had no sentiment whatsoever. Like, I've heard of Bitcoin, don't really know too much about it. About 1/3 of them were super skeptical. And they were skeptical because they've been introduced to Bitcoin via scams. So, BitConnect was obviously really famous here in the US, but there's a ton of those kinds of scams in Latin America, which is pretty frustrating because most people hear Bitcoin, they say, oh, I'm going to lose all my money with that. So I think in general, people either didn't have much of an opinion or had a mildly negative opinion when we started.
Part of the conversation around regulation of cryptocurrency in general is the fact that you can't really, there's a sense that you can't really advance what's good about the sector without somehow creating a filter to cut out the scams. It looked like from the study I read, you had 2 pervading hypotheses going into the study. Mm-hmm. What were those?
Yeah, so our 2 main hypotheses, one was that Bitcoin and stablecoins would be an interesting store of value. So for anyone that was afraid that the peso may devalue versus the dollar, that Bitcoin and stablecoins could provide them an alternative mechanism for storing their wealth. The second hypothesis was that people that were sending remittances or international payments would be open and excited to use Bitcoin to save 10 to 20% in fees.
What did you find out after the study based on what you initially thought? What changed?
Yeah, so 2 things. One, we found on the first hypothesis, I'm more bullish than ever on Bitcoin and potentially short-term stable coins as a store of value. What we found there was really interesting. So over 70% of the people that we surveyed were fearful of the peso devaluing versus the dollar in the next 1 to 3 years. So that was across the board. People were generally in agreement that they didn't think the peso was a good store of value. Now, of those same people, only 11% had access to a dollar-denominated savings account. And that was the highest percentage. That was the most common other financial instrument they had access to. So almost no one had access to stocks. Almost no one had access to other more exotic products. So most people simply had a peso savings account or nothing else. They were storing dollars under their mattress. So there's a bit, and by the way, that's for the middle class, right? The lower classes may not even have a bank account. I think 60% of Mexico is, relatively or extremely underbanked. So that was really interesting to us because people, they want a way out of the peso. They don't think it's a good store of value. They've seen the peso devalue, 2 or 3 times in their lifetime. But they don't have any options for storing their wealth elsewhere other than, physical dollars under the mattress. So I believe there's a huge opportunity there for Bitcoin and stablecoins.
Yeah. Why don't they have access to other financial assets or instruments?
Yeah, this is a really good question and something, I'm certainly not an expert in. But, first of all, there's a lot of regulatory issues. So, for companies like PayPal or other companies that want to offer access to, stocks and ETFs, that's been, I think, regulatorily very difficult to do so. The other thing is it just feels like the financial services industry has been, pretty complacent for the last couple of decades.
Mm-hmm.
Most of their users, they're targeting the very wealthy class that have the majority of the money. Obviously there would be a lot of opportunity in reaching sort of the long tail of people, but that would also take a lot of work to reach them. For example, building physical bank branches, that's not going to happen in smaller towns, that sort of thing. I think it's a mixture of regulatory issues and then also just general complacency from the legacy financial system.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the discussion around Facebook's Libra is like a lot of people are thinking and betting that it's Facebook looking at a way to get into Africa. And like I've had conversations with people and in that scenario, it's the same problem. Can you imagine what that process is to actually get people there to teach, small villages of people how to use a Bitcoin, like how to use a Bitcoin wallet? Like it would be
how to use a phone in some cases.
Yeah. I mean, and what's interesting is that I do think, we could talk about Libra. That's a whole separate conversation. But,
yeah, we should probably.
That's its own rabbit hole. But I do think that, Mexico is an interesting country because most people do have smartphones. Most people are, relatively internet literate. So I do think, if you had an easy to use product on their phone, and maybe that will be Libra or something like it. I do think people, could figure this out pretty quickly. It just hasn't been, I guess, a priority for companies yet. And I think, one thing that Bitcoin has done, and I believe Bitcoin is specifically valuable for a lot of other reasons, it's finite supply, it's censorship resistance, it's security model, et cetera. But I do think one sort of undervalued thing that Bitcoin is doing in the world is it's forcing competition. It's saying, okay, legacy financial system and big tech companies, you guys have to compete now with an open, decentralized, borderless currency. And if you can create products and services that are better, great, people will use them. And if you can't, we're here. So I think at the very least, it's putting a lot of pressure to innovate. And I would argue Libra as a result of that.
Yeah. But back to the demographics of your study. So I saw sort of an interesting thing where a lot of times when people talk about Bitcoin and they try and justify why it will be massively adopted in the future, that they point to millennials and the younger generations and they say something like, they're tech savvy and they'll get this, they play video games on their phone. Like it'll be intuitive for them. Whereas like the older generations will not get this. And your studies seem to indicate something different.
Well, yeah. So, I mentioned we had a couple of big findings. So one of those big findings that I'm really excited about is I think the key to Bitcoin adoption in Latin America, or at least in Mexico, is going to be making it a family affair. Right. I think that we saw 2 different things from the millennials and the baby boomers. So the baby boomers, they were harder to get to a workshop for sure. But if we get them to a workshop, the baby boomers understood the use case for Bitcoin immediately, right? We didn't have to explain why Bitcoin. When we could go up there and say, look, we have a currency that is modeled after gold. It has a finite supply. It can't be inflated. It can't be confiscated. Everyone got it like that, right? They've lived in Mexico. There was a massive devaluation in the 80s. There was the tequila crisis in the 90s. And like I mentioned, even since I've been there, there's been a steady devaluation in the last 5 years. So these adults understood the use case for Bitcoin without any explanation. Now, they didn't trust having any kind of digital currency. If it's something they can't hold in their hands, they can't really grasp their mind around the idea that, okay, is this really scarce, right? The kids had kind of the opposite perception. The kids were open to the idea of digital currencies. They were, I think, certainly quicker on the uptake with the apps and more interested in doing research around how Bitcoin works, but they haven't necessarily lived as an adult with assets through a massive financial crisis. So they were generally skeptical of the peso as well, but not like their parents. So my sort of thinking and what we're developing with some of our clients right now is, okay, cool. How do you, get the kids excited first and have them onboard their parents who have the savings, who have the, the assets to convert into stable coins and Bitcoin? I think that's going to be a really big opportunity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Speaking about past financial crises in Mexico, could you explain them a little bit more, like specifically the tequila crisis that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I'm probably not the right person. I'm not a super expert in this.
Yeah,
but at a very high level, I mean, what you have with any of these kinds of currency crises is, whenever a country or companies have, debt denominated, for example, in dollars, and they take out the loan at a very low interest rate, and then all of a sudden the interest rate starts rising, they have to pay the debt back in dollars. They don't have the dollars to pay it back, which means they have to print more of their local currency, pesos, to pay the currency back. That's, kind of a general formula for crises we've seen all around the world. So again, I can't speak exactly the specifics on each of those, but what ended up happening in both cases is, the government had, a peg between the peso and the dollar. They had to break the peg because they didn't have enough, pesos to pay back their dollar denominated debts. And then all of a sudden they have to print more pesos. And, this creates a devaluation. So again, certainly not claiming to be an economist there, and it may have gotten some things wrong, but at a very high level, that's generally how it works.
We don't even have Bitcoin economists yet. So as long as you stick to Bitcoin, you can't be proven wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think that the major idea is that when you're holding a currency that can be manipulated by a small group of people, whenever, for whatever reason, they decide to print more of that currency, your relative purchasing power as a percentage of the currency you hold is going to go down. That's the basic idea we've seen over and over and over again. In Bitcoin, you can't do that. And I think that's attractive for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's the upside down. But also, when we're thinking about Bitcoin, a lot of times I hear when I'm talking to people and trying to explain it to, people who don't use it, I hear it's not controlled by anyone. That's weird. Did you get anything of that? Like, did you get any sort of like concern that it was not being controlled or monitored by some entity? Was that expressed at all?
Well, maybe to take a step back, one thing that I think is important is, we would give sort of an overview on Bitcoin. But a lot of cases we found that wasn't necessarily the most important thing. There's a certain group of people that want to understand all of the governance and security models. There's a lot more people that basically just said, look, I have a problem. And that problem is I want to have money that can't be confiscated or inflated, or I want to send, cheaper payments overseas. And, I want the basics of why this is going to work. And then I want to test it and see if it works, right? So I think a lot of people weren't necessarily going into those deeper philosophical or technical understandings of how Bitcoin works. Now, for those that wanted to go deeper, and I've seen this even back in the States, explaining this to family and friends, the idea of a decentralized network is kind of hard to grasp. So I always start by saying, hey, do you guys know, what BitTorrent is, for example? Do you know why BitTorrent hasn't been killed after all of these decades? And people start thinking, oh, wait a second, it's because there's not one server hosting BitTorrent. There's, hundreds of thousands or, whatever it is, thousands of computers now that are running this software. And that's what Bitcoin is. And Bitcoin, is a decentralized peer-to-peer network that also has properties around emission of Bitcoin, the creation of Bitcoin already, written in. And at first people look at me like, man, I don't really trust computers. And I say something along the lines of, yeah, who do you trust more? The software that you can openly audit yourself, run on hundreds or, tens of thousands of computers right now, or a small cadre of people controlled by, bankers you may not know or politicians you may disagree with. And then folks start thinking, wait a second, this is kind of interesting. And yeah, I think in general, understanding a little bit about peer-to-peer networks has helped people. And if you don't have that initial, mental model or building block, it's a bit harder.
Sure. And then on the other side of it, you also invested into sentiment about Bitcoin as an international payment or remittance tool. Can you explain what you learned from the study in that scenario?
Yeah. So we, our other, again, hypothesis was we can save people 10 to 20% on international payments if they use Bitcoin. Great. This one was a big challenge. First of all, it was really difficult to get people to come to the workshops and spend 2 hours of their life learning about Bitcoin just to save 10 or 20%. What we ended up finding was, unless you have a real need, right? Unless you're sending money to a place where you don't have any other options. And in the case of Venezuela, that actually might be the case, or potentially other sanctioned states. But unless you have that specific use case, 10 to 20% savings was not enough of an incentive for people. And it makes sense because it's really hard. Like, in order to send Bitcoin, we had to help people open a cryptocurrency exchange account in Mexico. In our case, we use Bitso. Then they had to take that money, they had to send it to another exchange in another country, so open up another exchange account, or in the case of Venezuela, open up a local Bitcoins account, which is even harder to use. Then once they have it there, they have to figure out how to withdraw the Bitcoin from that second exchange into their, usually their parents' or their family's bank accounts, because their parents were not going to figure this out. So the people that did take the time and sit with this and do it, it usually took at least 1 to 2 sessions plus a follow-up to get them to fully figure this out and feel comfortable sending Bitcoin on their own. Now they're hooked and they're going to use Bitcoin forever. But that was, hours and hours of time. Most people aren't going to make that kind of upfront investment. So our takeaway is that Bitcoin is probably not ready for prime time in terms of international payments yet. Mm-hmm. Frankly, something like Libra or whatever is probably better for that in the short term. But Bitcoin makes a lot of sense for bigger companies or trading groups who are already doing remittances, who already have customers' trust, who just want to use the Bitcoin rails in the background. And we believe we can prove this. This is just a hunch, that a lot of the volume you see on local Bitcoins in countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, whatever, it's probably from companies or groups like that.
And can you explain what that kind of system would look like if companies were doing that?
Yeah, I mean, at a very high level, you could just say, hey, I'm your trader that you've been trading with, or your remittance company that you've been using for the last 2 years. You know me, you trust me, and you give me money. I'm going to get that money into your family's bank account in another country, within a day or whatever time period. And that's all you care about. You want to make sure that money gets there for the agreed upon amount at the agreed upon time. And you don't care how I do it. Now, if I'm smart and I recognize, okay, I could use, let's say in the case of Venezuela, I know some folks that are actually doing this. I'm going to use local Bitcoins myself, right? So I'm going to take the money you give me. I'll use local Bitcoins and get the Bolivares and the account of someone that's living over in Venezuela. And you never know Bitcoin was used. All you know is your money reached your parents' account. I think that's what people are doing.
Yeah. In that scenario, I guess, would transaction fees still be an issue? I know this is something more you're suspecting. So feel free to say that you just have not looked into it or.
Yeah. I mean, I think, certainly, again, I haven't looked super deep in that, but, transaction fees, when it's less than $2, it's probably worthwhile to use Bitcoin because of its liquidity. Above that, if you're doing much larger transactions and you could, for example, transfer the money into one, Venezuelan's account that can maybe then, retransfer that money to lots of other accounts for you. There's probably clever ways to do this. I think the key that Bitcoin has over any other currency there, and, again, some people, if they're using Ethereum or they're using, soon Libra, do this great, if that's what works for them. But I think the key with Bitcoin is its security and its liquidity. And liquidity is absolutely key. The ability to be able to cash out your Bitcoin for a local currency anywhere in the world, that's critical for people doing this.
Payments aside, what did you see as the biggest challenges facing Bitcoin adoption in Latin America?
I think the biggest challenge right now is it's too hard for people to use, and people either have no opinion or a negative opinion of it. So I think I think we need two things. I think we need much easier tools, right? We need for people to see use cases and see easy solutions for those use cases. And then eventually, over the long haul, I do think we need to see sort of more scalability around Bitcoin. Obviously, fees can't be like they were in 2017. That's not viable, at least for the users we're talking about. But I think we're going to get there. I think it's going to take some time. I think it's why it's good we're doing research now. This is not going to get done overnight. This is not going to get done by one group. I think this is going to be hundreds of companies and organizations that are figuring this stuff out. I think though, the most important thing is that we help people solve problems, right? Like a lot of us that listen to this podcast, myself included, are kind of, we're cryptocurrency geeks. This is fun for us. It's not fun for most people. And we have to remember that. So you have to solve problems. And that's what business is about, is finding a problem, offering a solution. It's not about technology. The technology is a tool. So I think, and we're to that end, we're working with a few clients on this right now. I think instead of saying, hey, use Bitcoin, you don't say, hey, use Bitcoin. You say, hey, you have pesos and you're afraid they're going to devalue. I have a solution to help you hedge against that currency risk. And that solution maybe is a combination of storing in stable coins, dollar-backed stable coins, and a little bit of Bitcoin. Or, hey, you have, you need to send money to a place, to your family, that for whatever reason it's difficult to get money in or it's highly expensive. I have a solution to help you do it easily. I think we need solutions-oriented thinking, not just technology.
So going into that too, I hadn't asked about the stable coins yet. What did you find about stable coins from the study?
This, is not super surprising, but we saw it in both studies very clearly. People want dollars, right? So we think in the US, we're very fortunate to have access to the global reserve currency, right? Most people don't have that access. And if they do, they're having to buy them, on gray markets on the street. So, almost every single person we talk to, if we said, hey, would you rather keep your money in dollars or pesos? Obviously they want dollars. I think that's probably true around the entire world. But most of them can't get access to dollars, at least digitally. So what we saw is that when we told people, hey, through cryptocurrency, you can get, access to a dollar-backed stablecoin, they were extremely excited about that. They were also excited about Bitcoin for its gold-like scarcity properties. And so one thing we've been playing with is the ability, to help people gauge their own risk profile and based on that, split their savings between stablecoins and Bitcoin. Most people wanted a mix of both, but I would say stable coins were probably the thing that excited people the most.
Okay, that makes sense as far as like trying to store value versus investment asset.
That's right. Yeah. If you want a little bit of speculation, and to be clear, right, like humans are humans. People always want to speculate. So there was some of that in there driving the Bitcoin piece, but in general, people trust dollars. Now, do they trust the new cryptocurrencies that are quote unquote, dollar backed? Like, Tether's obviously had all of its issues. Who knows if these new companies that are coming out, we did our best. In the case of Mexico, we only would help people acquire two things, Bitcoin and True USD, and that's it. And the reason is liquidity. Bitso basically has off ramps for True USD. So that's what we help people get.
So where are you now after the report? You brought up a little bit about this, but I was just curious.
Yeah. So right now I'm actually on a family road trip, but I'm actually going to to share our findings with a couple of other groups over the next 2 weeks in San Francisco and then Hong Kong. And then we're going to pick which sort of project to do next. We have a couple of different potential projects in the works, either in Mexico, with some of our current clients. We also have a couple of other opportunities we're exploring in other countries. I would, obviously I think going deeper on Mexico, we see a lot of opportunity there. I also think though, Bitcoin's going to get even more adoption in places like Argentina or Turkey, where there's a lot of inflation. So, we're at this moment trying to pick out what's the most effective project we can undertake. Where should there be work that there's not work right now?
Can you name a few other places in the world that you're looking at specifically?
Yeah, I'd say Argentina is probably top of the list. In that it's in Latin America, Spanish speaking, history of currency manipulation, super high inflation right now, but not Venezuela level. Obviously Venezuela is the sort of poster child for this right now with hyperinflation. Unfortunately, I think that while that work is extremely important, there's a lot of other stuff that needs to happen there just around basic human security, food access, water access. So
Sure.
I think in my mind, it's more interesting to get Bitcoin distributed in a place before it hits that level of, sort of crisis. Turkey is interesting. Iran is interesting. The Philippines are interesting. Brazil is interesting. Anywhere where you see lack of access to financial services, history of inflation, or sort of currency controls particularly. And people, I think this is undervalued, but people that are entrepreneurial, creative, willing to try and adopt new things. I think Argentina has a long history of that because of all their currency crises. So that's a really attractive one for me.
Max, I'm curious if you think there's a use case for Bitcoin adoption with the whole immigration crisis in the US.
Yeah, that's interesting. So to give people a bit of context, the US-Mexican remittance corridor is, I think it's the largest or second largest in the world. It's around $30 billion a year. It's massive. And before I went down to Mexico, I was in San Francisco and I was living in the Mission at the time. And so I went to just a bunch of Western Unions and those kinds of, money sending or money remitting stores, and basically just asked people online. I was like, hey, have you heard of Bitcoin? Would you be willing to send money to someone overseas or in Mexico if I could help you save, a little bit of money doing that? And what I found is that particular corridor is pretty well oiled, right? Like people that are using Western Union, I found were paying $5 to $10 on average. And, let's assume their average transaction is the same as in our study, which is about $100, $120. It's not terrible, right? It's not good. And we could certainly do a lot better. But when people, like the number one thing we found people wanted when sending money to another country is trust, right?
Yeah.
They're going to pay more if they know it's going to get there. They're not going to like try and skimp, save a couple bucks if there's the question of, will this reach my family?
Right.
So long-term, yeah, I do think there's a huge opportunity. I think there's some creative companies will figure out cool solutions. Short-term, I don't think it's top of the priority list.
And like outside of your study and workshops on the ground in Mexico around Bitcoin, you also rap about Bitcoin?
That's right. So my side passion for a long time is rap. I have actually a hip hop group in Mexico called AI. I go by the name Cypher Perro. And I published last year a song called We Take Bitcoin that, to my knowledge, is the only rap song that focuses on Bitcoin's core principles rather than just, getting rich or getting Lambos. And so I'm pretty proud of trying to spread the message through music.
Well, awesome, man.
Cool.
I think that's everything we have, right, Dave?
That's it, Max. Yeah. Thanks for taking the time to talk.
Cool. All right. Take care, guys. I see the world fall apart, all brain, no heart. Assumptions like Descartes, trapped in their own compartments. We commence. Special thanks to Max, aka Cypher Perro. You can find more information about Entiende Bitcoin and his music in the show's notes.
The Bitcoin Magazine podcast is a BTC media-produced podcast on the Let's Talk Bitcoin network. Stories in this episode come from articles written by Bitcoin Magazine rock stars Peter Chihuahua and Colin Harper. Theme music provided by Billy Sly from the Crypto Cantina. Outro music courtesy of Cypher Perro. Visit BitcoinMagazine.com for more in-depth news, analysis, and resources about the most successful peer-to-peer currency. And make sure to follow us on Twitter at Bitcoin Magazine. Find and subscribe to the show on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast. And if you're in a particularly generous mood, drop us a review. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see you next time.
Take Bitcoin. Yeah, we take Bitcoin.
We take Bitcoin.